Hello, welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with Toby Brookes and we had a fascinating conversation. And it starts with a book, A Place for Dorothy, All That She Brings. And what was interesting is it's a reflection of life. You start with something small. In this case, it was a short story. But by taking that leap of faith and just sitting down and writing a short story, you ended up at a trilogy. We discussed the second book. The third book is being written. But listen, Toby gets into how it happened, how it became an extended part of himself. And we get in a lot into what we learn about life along the way. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. And I'm fortunate that you could, seeing as you've just flown in from London.
Well, thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Morning, my time, of course.
Yeah. So how are you feeling? Are you feeling a little jet lagged or just sort of trying to get your bearings again?
Well, there's an 8-hour time change. And so I wanted to fall asleep, at 5 o'clock last evening, but I stayed up until 7 and I managed to sleep until 3 a.m. And then I got up and tried to be quiet because everybody else was sleeping. And I did some work actually from 3 to 5. I had a couple of cups of coffee. I'm actually feeling pretty good right now, but I know this afternoon it will hit.
Yeah.
It takes about, they say 1 day for every hour time difference.
Okay. I didn't know that. I've been to Australia once. I've been to California once, and both times jet lag was like, this hits hard. But I've never been.
Well worth it, I must add.
Yeah,
Trip to
definitely
London.
is. But I think there's a kind of, if you do it enough, you figure out what your body responds best to. And
Right. And there's a couple of key rules. Drink a lot of water and hopefully just a little alcohol, not too much. Eat properly and no naps. Try to get on that local time frame as quickly as possible.
yeah. So I suppose we should really start with your latest book.
Yes.
Tell us about that.
A Place for Dorothy is a sequel to my first book, All That She Brings, and it carries on the story of a young Matthew Banks living in Pasadena, California, just outside of Los Angeles. And Matthew's a young man of late 20s, early 30s by the sequel, and he's found himself in a precarious situation due to some poor decisions that have to do with the first book starts with a loss, the death of his wife, which throws him into a very dangerous place, and he makes mistakes and enters into a fraught relationship that has ramifications. I won't give out too many details, but he winds up in his mother's home in Pasadena, which she has left him after her death. So he's dealing with a couple of different deaths. And his father has reappeared after a 15-year absence. He was painting in the south of France. So he's dealing with a number of things at once. And what I'm trying to do is put him in a position where, and it's an old theme, David, put a character in a hole and figure out a way to get him out.
Yeah.
Or display his attempt to get out. Anyway, the sequel picks up 2 years on after he's moved to California, and his life is coming together, but things keep smacking him in the face, as life does. And it's an ongoing story about his attempt to right the ship and to come out of this hole and be a good, healthy person again.
Well, it's interesting that you just said that. I think the phrase you used, it's an old theme where we put somebody in a hole and we want to see them get out, or at least learn how they try to get out, whilst they also get smacked in the face again. And I wonder if that human obsession that we have with these stories is because we can connect with them so well?
It's a really good question. No one escapes these types of experiences, whether it's the death of a loved one or betrayal or just some bad luck. I was living a life I was raised in a comfortable family in the Midwest, very loving, whole family, nuclear family, where our life was disrupted very quickly when my dad died suddenly when I was 17. And at that point, it was my first introduction to the fact that you can get the rug pulled out from under you just like that. I mean, it happened so quickly, and I became fascinated with uh, how we react to these kinds of things and what it does to us near term and long term. And I wanted to capture that. I kind of wanted to document it for myself later in my life because there were other things, a divorce and other things I went through. But I kind of wanted to get into it and dissect the the pathology of it and what it does to us because we all go through it and many of us try to deal with it by not dealing with it.
Yeah,
Many of us get therapy, which is highly recommended. But, many of us just sort of bump along and try to make the best of things. And these things change us. And we are some of our experiences. And
yeah,
I
we
think
are.
it's important. I think it's important that we take stock of these things.
Who was your father?
My father was a guy named Jack Brooks. He was a steel salesman. He sold steel to GM, General Motors in Detroit. Very successful, did very well, and just keeled over of a heart attack at 47. Um,
But who was he? Who was he as a person? Because it's interesting. You said at 17 when it happened, it pulled the rug from under your feet, and I took that to mean it wasn't just the unexpected nature; it was the hole that was left behind.
Absolutely. Um, he had come from a broken family, a very wealthy broken family. His father was a very prominent attorney in Washington, and he went to prep schools and good colleges, but he lived in a broken family. And I had three brothers, so he insisted on raising a more traditional nuclear family and keeping us together. And none of us had the opportunity to go to public or private schools. He kept us home. He kept us really close to the fold, unlike his own father. And so he had built this nucleus and a lot of love. And as with my mother, they
Mm.
both sort of into this pact together to raise these four rambunctious boys. And then dad disappeared, and I say through no fault of his own, he was a heavy smoker. He could have taken better care of himself. But, it was just a random occurrence that nobody saw coming. And yeah, it got everybody's attention, to say the least.
It's interesting. You mentioned about writing and exploring these things when you're younger as well, but also so you can find out about yourself when you're older. And your dad took a path, I imagine, at a very young age, where he knew how he wanted his family raised, and it was. You mentioned about how much there was love in the family and that kind of nucleus, which is the exact opposite of his own upbringing. But to have that foresight that there's a different way that I need to do this when I have my family at such a young age is a lot of wisdom.
And a lot of empathy. He was full of it, and as tough and arrogant and precise as his father was as a attorney and ruthless. Apparently, I didn't know him very well. My father was the opposite, and it wasn't so much the family he wanted to create; it was the family he didn't want to create because that's
Yeah,
what he knew.
but
Same thing,
yeah,
turning it on its head.
but it's often.
And
Sorry, I was going to say I didn't mean to cut you off. I do apologise.
that's
Often,
okay.
as young men, we can get blinded by our bitterness, and instead
Mhm.
your father knew what he didn't want, so he created an environment to allow what he felt was the best nurturing environment, instead of like,
Exactly.
well, I'll do this because it's how I was raised. It was like, no, do you know what, I don't want to bring a life into that. And that the culture that existed in that time, to go against that, there's a lot of integrity in that, in knowing that that's not for you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting you mentioned that bitterness because my protagonist, Matthew Banks, is is full of bitterness, and it doesn't serve him well. He makes bad decisions, desperate decisions, cruel decisions. Um, in fact, most people don't like him in these books. And they say the guy's kind of a jerk. And I said, just hang on, keep reading. He's gonna figure it out. And they go, well, come on now. Uh, but that when my dad died and our family sort of became unglued, because at that point I was the third oldest, we were all sort of dispersing off to school, off to
Mm.
relationships, leaving the I was terribly afraid of becoming bitter. And I was terribly afraid of becoming a different person as a result of this shock. And the character I've created in All That She Brings and A Place for Dorothy is really struggling with this. And it's interesting because this is actually the first time I've recognized this. Matthew's the guy I didn't want to become. And rather than write a hero who figures it all out and everyone's all happy and full of smiles and good luck, uh, I thought it was a lot more interesting to write about somebody who couldn't figure it out, at least not at first.
It's,
So I'll take a brief moment to say this is one book became two, and two books has become a trilogy. And I'm halfway through writing the last book, where Matthew finally figures it out, and he becomes the likable guy that everybody wants him to be. And it wasn't easy creating a character that nobody liked, but was still rooting for. And that was one of my great challenges.
it's interesting because you mentioned how you wrote a character that you was afraid of being, and in kind of therapy circles they would say that would be kind of falling in love with your shadow side, because you kind of recognize that, and you've put that person onto paper. It's almost like a cathartic exercise in, this is everything I'm afraid of being. And
Absolutely.
and I find, and it could definitely be different for you, but I find that the people that sometimes I get that can get under my skin, it's because I'm afraid I see too much of them in myself, and it's a character that perhaps I don't like, and you're almost bringing that shadow side to life, but with the caveat of, I'm going to make him come good, so that I can actually like, and in that therapy circle of falling in love with your shadow side, becoming his best fan.
Right. Right. Well, yeah, and in a work of fiction, and I'm new at this, by the way. I spent a career in marketing, and I was a journalism major and learned to write the news, basically, very stripped down, bare information. But I always wanted to be Ernest Hemingway, who
Yeah.
was a reporter, became a novelist. I mean, say what you will about Ernest Hemingway, he could write. He wrote some beautiful literature. Um, and I can't remember where I was going with this, but as I wrote this, I you have to create an arc for a character, and you can't just go through his daily routine and keep a flat reporting of his life. You need to create movement, and in Matthew's arc, it's up and up and up, and it flattens out, and it goes down a little bit, and then it goes up, but by the end of this series, he will complete this full arc, and he will be a happier, better person. So the change is what keeps the reader turning the page.
Just
Um,
quickly, for those that aren't familiar, why did you say, despite, you can say what you want about Hemingway, but he wrote some beautiful poetry?
well, he was a known misogynist, a racist, a
Yeah,
homophobe.
of his time.
Um, much more acceptable or less detestable at that time.
The,
You
the,
know,
the only reason I ask is one, I know him as what one of the greatest writers of his era, but I don't know
right.
much about him as an individual. Um, and I was just curious because literally everything you described is your average man of that era.
That's true.
I'm not justifying. I'm not. I just very
No, no,
care.
no, I know.
It's just like
Yeah,
he was a misogynist, correct for the era, correct for the time, a homophobe, correct for the time, racist, correct for that culture in America at that time. It's just that was the life that he was in, and within that, he still managed to write some beautiful things.
absolutely. I mean, it could be argued he was mad, you know, for the entire time. He became worse as he became more ill later in life, when I think he was psychotic, basically. He was an alcoholic. But don't some of our greatest artists share that mania, that craziness, that sort of
I think
off
I think
bit?
they do. I think because they go to a place that they're prepared to go, that the rest of us steer clear of. You know
Absolutely.
that you
Yeah.
you have to for them to. How can I? I'm trying to figure out what I'm trying to say. They will explore something and put it on paper with a kind of it is what it is, and
Mm,
don't take any judgment of it more than that. So it doesn't matter if they've poured out their greatest fears or their greatest love. They look at it as they're just telling a truth, and they don't steer clear of it in any way, shape, or form. Where the rest of us dare not cross that path to explore that truth.
right. And the truth can be very ugly.
Oh yeah.
And,
Well, like we were
and
just saying, the era of that
yeah,
time by today's standards was incredibly
right,
ugly.
right. But that truth is also art. It can be art.
Mm.
And you can see it in visual arts. You can see it in painting. You can see it in all kinds of different types of art. I couldn't finish. I had a hard time finishing A Place for Dorothy because I felt that Matthew had to reach the promised land and be a lovable character. And I couldn't get him there. And I came up with an ending. I fabricated an ending that was it showed some resolution and showed some renewal, and it was happy and off into the sunset. And I wasn't happy with it. And I read an interview with Sam Shepard, who I admire, passed away, I think, a year ago. Writer, filmmaker, actor. I mean, he was quite a guy. Uh, Playwright, terribly talented. And he said endings are the hardest thing to write, and they always gave him trouble. And when he really didn't like an ending he came up with, he just turned it on its head. He just completely reversed course. And I did that with A Place for Dorothy, but what that meant was that there's no happy ending. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of people that read this book that I've talked to say, we were really hoping for a different ending, and I said, I'm sorry, it didn't come, and I wasn't going to fabricate something I didn't feel he had earned. And so, of course, I have to write a third book. My wife goes, "A third book?
do,
Enough of this Matthew already."
yeah. Do you think that's maybe a reflection of your own insights that we do, like you say, that there's this part of us that when we're writing and we're putting something down, we want that beginning, the middle, and the end. And
Right.
but as you were saying at the beginning, that it took him a while to become, starts off at one age and then he's at this age by the time he gets to the end. And there's this growth in life, and sometimes you can't rush that. And obviously, you somehow. I don't get the feeling it was resisting the temptation for him to evolve quicker than he should have. More, is it a reflection of no, that's not right? He wasn't old enough, wasn't experienced enough to come full circle yet to come good.
That's right. And things keep happening. Things keep getting in the way that prevent his recovery. He continues to get knocked down and continues to have reason to be skeptical and cynical. And it could be argued that there may be too many of these events that happened to him. But they're not all bad either. I must
No.
say there's some fun things that happen that make you laugh, and he does have some joy in his life. He fathers a daughter that really helps keep him sane and gives him reason to get out of bed in the morning. Out of wedlock, but nonetheless, it's his daughter, and he sees her a lot. But yeah, I mean, he has to figure this out, and he does eventually. But as I said, it'll be in the next book.
Yeah, it does. Um, when you first started writing them, when you go back to like the first pages, did you think then it was going to be 2 books?
No, no, no. In fact, it started as a short story.
I like that.
I took a short story course with a pretty well-known editor from a major publishing house who teaches out here in California. And I wrote a short story about renewal and tragedy and renewal and recovery. Man in a hole, how does he get out? And it was about a 5,000 word story. And my teacher, the guy named Tom Jenks, said, this is a great story. You should keep going. And I said, yeah, I liked that because again, I had trouble ending it. And he said, well, keep it going. And so I went back and started to just I kept the tape rolling, and it turned into All That She Brings. And in fact, I hired him to edit it. And then that book, and I thought that would be the only book. I thought it would have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it does, but the end is a little open-ended. As I say, there's some bowling pins in the air.
Yeah.
And people would say, gosh, that ending was interesting, we really want to know what happens next. Like, we're not done with him. You got to tell us what happens next. And I said, well, maybe I'll just have to write another book. And I figured it was either a good ending or a bad ending, and I still don't know if it was a good ending or a bad ending because everyone was hanging on to this guy's life, which was precarious but showed promise.
Yeah, it's interesting. Isn't it? I love that evolution of a short story, 5,000 words, and then before now you have a trilogy.
Yeah, and I wonder if a good editor would have forced me to condense it into one big book, but so it is. It's a trilogy. I'm just reading right now. I just finished Colm Tobin's most recent novel, Long Island.
Mm-hmm.
Famous Irish novelist. He's one of my favorite current contemporary writers. That's a sequel to a book he wrote 13 years ago called Brooklyn, which became a pretty well-known movie.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, and he's just a great writer. And here's this sequel, Long Island, that comes out 13 years later, and it takes place 20 years later, where his last book left off. And I was reading a review in the London Review of Books, in fact, that said, the sequel is great, but the ending, come on. There's got to be a third book because we don't know what happens next. And he's caught, I suspect, not to compare myself with Colin, but I suspect he got caught in the same trap where you get into these people's lives and it's not so easy to get out. It's really not.
Because that's the truth, isn't it? And for anyone listening to this who's like wondering, where do I start a story? Where do I start? Just try and make it 5,000 words. Try and get a beginning, a middle, and the end in 5,000 words, and then from there, once you've got that little short story, see if there's more that you can put into it.
Right.
Can you add another short story to that one end?
Yeah. Short stories they're their own art form. I think they're very difficult to write well.
You can't have detail in a short story. You can't. And what I mean by that is you've got to be clear and concise from all the way through it. You can't go off on a tangent. You've got to kind of keep that journey where you want them to go. Whereas in a larger book, you can explore the narratives, you can explore the people, you can give background and context.
Right. And that's both a great thing and also, sort of a burden. You know the old expression that a novelist is a failed poet,
Yeah,
and a poet is a no, no, no. A novelist is a failed short story writer, and a short story writer is a failed poet.
yeah,
Because, as you go down
yeah,
with a short story, every word, every sentence becomes critical. It has to earn its own keep. In a
it
book, every chapter or paragraph has to earn its own keep. In a poet, every word
has, yeah.
has to justify itself.
And it's
So it's the most precise form of writing there is.
it is because I mean it reminds me of when you see those short films. They're like 5 to 7 minutes long, and everything is in that one scene.
Right.
And the person that's doing the short film can't go off on a tangent, can't leave that scene. Everything that happens has to happen in that moment.
Right.
And with those short stories, for it to be successful, which is obviously why you weren't able to finish your short story, is you have to have a definitive end.
Right.
You can take somebody almost through the middle. You can start in the middle of something, but it has to have a
Right.
definite end for the short story to work. And like,
Right.
fortunately for you, maybe not your wife, but fortunately for you, you couldn't find that end. So now you've got a trilogy.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah, and then I'm faced with the big question, what do I do next? Because I'll tell you what, David, I retired. I left the business world about 6 or 7 years ago, a couple of years before COVID. And, watch out what you ask for. I mean, I don't know what I'd do if I didn't have this to do. My
Mm.
wife kept working. She was working through COVID, but I had my first book, All That She Brings, to write through COVID. And it's really sustained me. It's been a wonderful second act, if you will.
Yeah.
And it's something I can do the rest of my life as long as I keep my brain intact, which, we'll see about that.
It's fortunate though, isn't it? Because you've always enjoyed writers. You've always enjoyed the art of storytelling. And although you said at the beginning about being a journalist and having to write sort of to a very strict format in a sense, just to the point, it does enable a discipline to come in. And you get the cliches of deadlines and stuff like that, but it's when all you know what to do is write. Here you get to explore what to write and how to write and why to
Mm,
write.
right. And those are all fiction is a wonderful sense of freedom. You can make anything up. People ask me, is this guy Matthew Banks you? And I go, God, I hope not. But yeah, part of
Yeah,
him is me. But I made up a whole bunch of him. And then other parts are amalgamations of groups of people that I know. But you have that freedom.
yeah.
And that's the lovely thing about fiction. And it's got to make sense,
Mm.
and it has to be mostly believable. But let it rip, let it go. Let your craziest ideas fall on the page. And if they don't work, you take them out later.
Because I've said to people on the podcast before that the great thing sometimes about writing is when you explore the idea that that character is a version of my personality that may be suppressed, maybe is out there. But what you get to do with that is, and I think this is what the best writers do, they get to take a version of that personality, give it a character, give it an ego, and let it explore at the right into the depths of what your own fantasy would be if you were really inclined to live as that person. And
Mm,
you get to just put it all on paper as if you're living it in the moment, how you want the
mm,
outcome to be, how you want what you want the jeopardy to be, how you want them to overcome it. And if they're a luckless person, you can give them as many kick-ins as you want. But if they're
right,
a go-getter who nothing ever stops them, you can give them a solution to everything. and and,
right,
and, you, and you can just go, you can really go wild with an alter ego in any direction you want.
right.
But it's about tapping into those little parts of your brain that you kind of would indulge if the sensible part of you didn't kick in.
Absolutely. And, and they say there is no fiction. It's all part of our lived experience, and that's true.
Yeah,
I'm reading right now James Joyce, A Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man. I've never read it. It's a classic, and they say it's an autobiographical novel. So it's a story about Stephen Douglas, who is James Joyce, and it follows his young life through it. It's a coming of age story, but he creates this character in Stephen that is beyond him. And H.G. Wells said that James Joyce created a character that, unlike any other character that's ever been created in fiction, from the sense that you knew this person. You knew this person so well that you believed you were living with this person.
yeah,
And I mean, it's such a gift. And of course, Joyce introduced a lot of things like uh, stream of consciousness writing and interiority. And, he was there with Virginia Woolf in the early days of very modernist writing, but he kind of changed the rules. But to your point, he took a character based on himself and then made that character into other things that maybe he wanted to be or maybe he didn't want to be, but it made him a bigger character and believable,
yeah.
that's quite something.
Well, because I mean, sometimes I don't know why, but it's popped in my head, so I'll go with it. When you talk about engaging in the ultimate, like almost childlike fantasy and making it believable, you get John Wick.
Mm.
This crazy assassin that runs around because somebody shot his dog.
Who cannot be killed.
Yeah, who cannot? Yeah, exactly. And it's cannot be defeated, cannot be killed, can wear bulletproof suits, and lives in this weird underworld where everybody just knows who he is. And it's the craziest fantasy, but so
Yeah,
many people are addicted to it. It's like, because
I think they've milked that pretty much for all it's worth. But
yeah,
I agree. It is. It's a fantasy.
yeah, but there's a part of us all that has that little boy fantasy in our head that would love that to be a version of John Wick, and we get to escape in that, whilst it's still knowing. And I think this is where the art form is good, whilst still knowing it's ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, it almost has a cartoon character, a
Yeah,
cartoon feel to it. But you're right. I mean, who doesn't want to engage in that fantasy?
yeah.
I mean, no wonder it's so popular.
I think you're right. I think they've got one more coming out.
I would not be surprised.
Mm. But going back to the books, there's a part that come through. What are some of the dilemmas that the character has to deal with?
Well, in the first book, All That She Brings, it opens with Matthew Banks living this fairly idyllic life outside of Hartford, Connecticut, with his new bride. And he's an artist at heart. He's a sculptor, and his mother wouldn't let him study art in college. She paid for a business degree, so he wound up in the. I couldn't think of a worse place to wind up other than the insurance business. So I put him in the insurance business. And I don't want to give too much away, but early in the book, she's tragically killed in a
Yeah,
car accident. And this throws him. That would be analogous to me losing my father. And I drew on those
yeah,
emotions and those deep memories that I have. And he's reeling, and he does some really stupid stuff. And then he finds out he gets a new mattress, and he finds some love letters. She's been having an affair up until the time she died with some guy up in the state of Maine, which really sends him into, the stratosphere in terms. He's just completely detached, and I won't go into too much more detail, but he winds up falling in love with his therapist and getting her pregnant. So that's another plot twist, that these things, are meant to keep the reader reading.
because
Anyway, he doesn't want to marry her, and when his mother dies out in Pasadena, it's his perfect excuse to leave. He quits his job. He moves to California. He moves into this huge hacienda that his mother has left him, only to find his father there waiting for him, trying to get a piece of his mother's will. So that's the setup.
It's an interesting one because I have a friend, a guy I used to know. I haven't seen him since lockdown. We used to get to the same gym, and he tragically that happened to him. His wife of many years died, and after her death, he found out she'd had several affairs.
Can you imagine?
It left him. He never recovered. He would talk to me about it, but he never recovered, and mourned her, deeply missed her. He loved his wife, deeply missed her, but he could not get over the heartbreak and the betrayal, and it was caught up in that grief because he found out relatively quickly after he'd buried her, because to the point he'd never been back to the grave. He couldn't face it because he just said he was filled with so much hate and anger for her.
And yet he wanted to love her.
He still did. I think that was that conflict. Yeah. He hated her and loved her, missed her dearly, but could not get past his anger for finding out he'd been betrayed more than once by more than one guy. And yeah,
brutal.
Yeah. And when I was talking to him about it, it was 5 or 6 years later, and it was, you could almost say it was as raw as if it happened the month before.
Well, these are the questions that I raise in my books. What do these things do to us, long term and short term? How do we recover? And if we are a different person, how are we different? Are we cynical? Are we unable to get into another relationship? Are we unable to trust again? Do we have to live inside our own heads for the rest of our lives and struggle with these unresolved issues? I mean, all those things are possible, but we're all different. So we all react differently and move forward differently or backward, whatever the case may be. Matthew moves both forward and backward, but ultimately forward.
It is difficult, isn't it? Because when you find yourself in these positions, it's very hard. I think you made a really good point about not being. How do you not be cynical? How do you not get inside your own head? You've got to find a way to figure it out, but at the same time, you don't want to feel that pain again.
Yeah, and is a life full of cynicism worth living? I mean, that's not how we're supposed to live. You got to get through that. You've got to find a way to get back to the place where you realize that life is a gift.
Yeah.
And by the way, we're the only ones that can turn it around. It's up to us to make it what it is. We all know a lot of people that never get to that point. They wallow in pity and resentment, and and I can see myself going there, and I refuse to go there. And that's kind of what these books are about.
Where does that strength come from then?
It's a good question. I'm not overly spiritual. I believe in God. I say prayers occasionally, go to church once or twice a year. But I think it's a belief that life is a gift, and this is not a dress rehearsal. This is like a one-shot deal.
Well, because it's interesting because you say you refuse to go there, but you acknowledge an existence of another side that you have to keep at bay. Like, hang on, I'm not doing this. This isn't how life is to be led.
Right. I mean, don't you think that's an easy path to take? It's not a good path to take, but it's another way to solicit pity and attention and love. Oh, poor old me, poor little me. Someone take care of me.
I agree, but there's a tone in your conviction that seems to be one disciplined about it. The thing that's kind of like pricked my ears up and it's like, oh, hang on a second, is you recognize it So it's almost like it's been a companion with you by your side.
Mm,
But you're like, no, no, I'm not doing that. So there seems to be this big personal boundary that says, yeah, yeah, I know you exist, and I could come over and join you anytime. But
mm,
but your conviction is very much life is a gift, and I will
mm,
not indulge in that.
I will not waste it.
Yeah,
And who knows where that comes from, David? I think I was number three of four brothers, four boys. And as number three, I had two older brothers that beat me up pretty regularly, which it wasn't abusive, but it was just sort of the way it was.
it's still hard though.
And I had to learn how to be resilient. And I took it out on my little. I had one younger brother that I got to beat up, but then when I beat him up, it was another reason for them to beat me up. So we all learned pretty quickly that was kind of foolish. But I built this shell. I could see being poor little old me, and I would run to my parents and say, Chris just beat me up, Jeff just beat me up, and they'd do whatever they had to do to intervene. But I realized at some age that I couldn't keep going to my parents.
Hmm.
I had to figure out this myself. And it was probably when I started swinging back at my brothers and started, connecting once or twice and became their size that, I realized it's up to me. And, thank God for that because I could have been a victim
Yeah,
forever.
it's interesting, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
that's literally just the difference between two people who could walk the same path. It's that
Yeah.
mindset of I can be a victim, or no, I'm not doing that.
Yeah. And, I was blessed to have two parents who were inherently happy people. I
Mm.
mean, they were fun to be around. They were morally grounded, but they weren't stiff. They weren't overly religious, but they insisted on honesty and living forthrightly. But mostly they were full of love and full of happiness. And I think that's partly genetic in me and also my other three brothers, but it's also partly a learned behavior. And when you have that as a base growing up, you realize that's really where you want to be in
Yeah,
life. That's where you want to end up and live your life. And I have a lot of friends and acquaintances who weren't as fortunate as I and grew up in really challenging, in some cases, abusive environments at home, whether it was alcoholism or divorce, whatever it was. And I see them struggle to be steady and to be stable and to be happy and not cynical and not questioning and not um, insecure.
yeah,
So I think the best thing we can give our kids is that unconditional sense of love and the need to appreciate life and make it as good for you and others as you can. And I think, that's a good place to start.
it is. It is. Just quickly, I seen in the bio that was sent to me that you took a 2-year writing program at Stanford University,
Mm,
um, and you also mentioned you did some short writing as well, and
mm.
with the chap, sorry, I've forgotten his name, who edited your book. Um,
Tom Jenk,
sorry,
yeah,
Tom.
Jenk,
J-
J.E. Google him. He edited every major American writer in the 20th century. He's a force. Really good guy too.
So, what what was the best learning you got from these writing programs?
Hmm. I think the most important thing I learned was the need to write, um, and that you can learn mechanics and you can learn structure, but to find your own voice, and we all have one, you have one, I have one, anyone who tries to write has a voice, whether it appears or not. You need to write. You need to just keep it going, and you will fall into a rhythm and a tone and an attitude and a perspective that is only you, that is it's as unique as your fingerprint. And you can copy people. I copied Hemingway for years. And I don't regret that because it really taught me a lot about putting words together in terms of rhythm. But eventually I had to shift to my own way of expressing myself. And you only get that through regular writing. And it's hard to write when you don't know if you're any good.
Mm.
And it's hard to write if you think you may never be published, which most people aren't, let's face it. But you got to do it and seek counsel from people that you trust. Like a guy like Tom Jenks, who, he edited Philip Roth, for crying out loud. He edited some of the greatest writers of the 20th century. And when something didn't work, he just exit out. No comment, just great, great. It was brutal, but it was a way of learning that it didn't fit. And so find somebody you trust, write, and read. Read the people you want to write like. Read the people you really admire. And I'm a inveterate. I read constantly. I read more than I write. I read 2 or 3 books a month,
Wow.
and it's one of my favorite pastimes. But you can learn to write by reading. I'm a big believer in that, by reading the right people.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Writing, so reading. I'm not kind of like anchored to any one particular view, other than if you want to write, you have to figure out a way to have a ritual practice where you're sitting down writing. It doesn't matter, I don't care how you do it. I don't care if you do it every day, twice a week, or once a week. There has to be something where your brain, somewhere deep in your subconscious, says, for the next 6 weeks, 6 months, or 12 months, on these days at this time, I'm sitting down writing. You have to sort of expect it of yourself, so that the rest of your brain can switch off until you're in front of your desk getting down to do it.
Absolutely, it's a discipline. There's no question about it, and it's not always easy. It's not always fun. In fact, it's rarely fun. It's
It's true.
although when I get into it, as David Foster Wallace once said, when I'm really writing, I can't feel my ass in the seat,
Yeah.
which I love that expression. You're into it, you're in the zone, and that's a great place to be. It
Yeah,
really
because
is.
I signed, I haven't written anything for a few years now, but it's one of those things where sometimes all you've got to do is convince yourself to write a sentence.
Mm,
And if nothing else happens after that sentence, it doesn't matter. You had the discipline to stick to that commitment, because the
right.
next time you sit down to that commitment, that sentence, you create the possibility for that sentence become a paragraph. And as long as you just commit to the time, the place, and just trying to write something down, it doesn't take long before you've written some chapters that you never had an idea about and had never planned.
That's right. That's exactly right. That's the beauty of fiction writing. Some fiction writers plot things out. They're called plotters or plotsters, and they follow an outline and then they write it out. And that's one way to go about it. But most people, and I'm one of them, just it. Somebody, I think it was Tobias Wolff, compared it to driving it on a road at night alone, and your headlights are shining only so far ahead, and that's as far as you can see. You don't know what is beyond that edge of darkness, and that's what writing a book of a novel is like. You don't know where it's going. You just keep driving, and the light keeps getting further out there. And it's a great analogy, because I don't know where my books are going, and they just sort of take on a life of their own, and it's a wonderful thing.
It does, isn't it? 'Cause that's almost a perfect analogy sometimes for writing, because you don't know because it's dark. You can only see as far as the headlights, and somewhere around the corner is a gas station, further down the road is a junction, and
Right.
and you've just got to figure out the journey between those points.
Right.
And you might even
Yeah.
chuck in a flat tire or a wonky
Yeah.
windscreen
You may
wiper.
run out of gas.
Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
Keep the metaphor going. Keep the metaphor rolling, as they
Yeah,
say.
yeah, exactly that. And along the way at the gas station, you bump into somebody, and that becomes another
Yeah.
separate
And
story.
that person pulls a knife on you and steals your watch.
Yeah, No,
Then we see we could just start a book.
but this is, I think, what people kind of hook themselves up on that prevents them from doing it is
Right.
that, like you said, that they want to know the outcome. Just like, no, just worry about the next quarter of a mile.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, John Irving used to write the ending first.
Mm.
I, and I think he has done that with most of his novels. He was a great writer. Cider House Rules, all those books he wrote. But I can't imagine doing that because I don't know where I don't know what the ending's going to be. I know what the ending is going to be in my last book, but generally I do not know where it's
I
headed.
remember when I wrote my first book. It's a book about reincarnation from the point of view of somebody that kills himself. So I knew the ending because he
Mhm.
commits suicide in the first chapter. So it's just like, so it's now what happens to the soul and how does it reincarnate. So I had a beginning, I had an ending, and the only thing I realised, like while tripping myself up trying to figure out the perfect way to write something, was just treat each chapter like an individual short story.
Right,
And as
right.
soon as that clicked in my head, I pretty much just sat down and started writing a book, and it took a few weeks.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at building a story.
Yeah,
When I'm awake at night, I'll write a chapter in my head, like what's going to happen next. And I'll write a chapter, not word for word, but
yeah.
here's what's going to happen. And
Just
the
an
next
idea,
chapter.
just an outline of
Right,
where this
right,
of the next short story, and
right.
similar to how you got yourself into this mess in the first place. You wrote a short story that you couldn't get an end into, that you didn't like,
That's right.
and it
That's
became a
exactly right.
trilogy.
Right.
But
That's exactly right.
but it was just it was literally just the chapter, the first chapter, and it's just like, okay, so
Right.
how do I create
Right.
an ending? Well, I better write another chapter, and it unfolds and goes off in different places. Hello. So it's
My wife and our puppy just walked in.
that's okay.
Yeah, but that's eventually it has to end, unfortunately. And the endings are hard. There's no
Yeah,
question about it.
yeah, there are, and sometimes I think people do get too hung up on that, and it's again, it's cliched. Like, how do I know when the book will end? Well, there's your answer.
Right.
If you need to know, it's because you haven't written the story yet.
That's right.
Just write the
You know,
story; it'll naturally just close itself out.
getting back to what I've learned, um, I mentioned Tom Jenks. He teaches the formula of CAR. Every scene, and that could be a chapter, it could be a couple of paragraphs. Every scene should have start with a conflict,
Hmm.
uh, introduce action. Like, what does the conflict produce? What's the energy that follows the conflict? And then a resolution, CAR. And that arc should adhere to every short scene or entire novel.
Yeah,
An ending has to resolve. It has to be a denouement, as I say. It has to make sense as some kind of resolution for a true ending. I mean, if you want to write a trilogy, I can tell you from my own experience.
but like you say, it's a trilogy. The seed of that trilogy came from a short story.
Right, exactly.
So
Yeah, who'd have thought?
exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant though, and hopefully it's a good example for everyone to just start writing somewhere, and you never know where that story can take you.
Let it go. Yeah.
Just quickly before I let you go, I'd just like to ask everybody this random question. Um, if you could imagine, it's a magical world, wizarding world, time machine, whatever, it doesn't matter. But you can go back to any place in time in history. Where would you go? Why would you go there? What car would you drive? And what music would you listen to?
Having just come from London, um, at the risk of sounding mad, I will say that I think I spent at least one previous life in 19th century London, somewhere around the St. James's area. It seems to be where I gravitate.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I'd be reading Virginia Woolf, and I'd be doing a hell of a lot of walking because that's what they did back then. And I'd be drinking, claret and probably smoking. I'm not sure what I'd be listening to. Probably symphonic music,
Hey,
but
drinking and
something
smoking works well.
there's something about that era and that part of the world. And I'm English on both sides, so
Okay.
both my parents' forebears came over in the late 16th century to America
All
as
right.
pure English people,
Yeah, yeah.
and so I would have loved to live during that period.
That's perfect.
It's a great question. Great question.
You're welcome. And thank you very much for coming on. I've really appreciated it.
It's been a real pleasure, David. Thank you for having me.
And there you go. That was Toby and I talking. And heed the message. Toby made a very good point where he is resolute in the way he focuses his mind and his refusal to cross the road to that dark side, that shadow side sometimes that some of us can be guilty of falling into. Not all the time, but some of the time. And for some people, too much of the time, where you define yourself as a victim. And sometimes the only difference between you and a victim is that mindset. So please do check out Toby and his books. And as always, wherever you are from, whatever you believe, thank you for listening. Please do take care and be blessed.